It's Wednesday morning. Let's get started sa mga impormasyong napapanahon at on demand. Ako si Lois Calderon at ito ang NewsWatch Live. Simulan natin sa update sa Bagyong Marce. Nakataas na ang signal number 2 sa eastern portion ng Babuyan Islands at northern portion ng Cagayan na kapwa pwedeng tamaan ng bagyo. Ayon sa pag-asa, posibleng maglandfall si Marce sa alinman sa dalawang lugar Huwebes ng gabi. Maaari pa ding itong lumakas bago dumaan o tumama sa Cagayan o Babuyan Islands. Higit isang dosenang lugar naman sa Luzon ang nasa ilalim ng wind signal number 1. Kabilang dyan ang mga hinagupit ng mga nagdaang bagyo gaya ng Batanes, Ilocos Provinces at Isabela. Huling namata ng bagyo sa may Tugigaraw, Cagayan, taglay ang lakas ng hangin ng 140 kilometers per hour at bugsong umaabot sa 170 kilometers per hour. Inaasahang lalabas si Marce sa Philippine Area of Responsibility sa Biyernes. Mainit at dikit ang laban ni US Vice President Kamala Harris at dating US President Donald Trump sa eleksyon ngayong araw. Nagsara na ang halalan sa 6 na states sa Amerika, kabilang na ang Georgia na isa sa 7 battleground states. Batay sa ilang pagsusuri, mananalo ang Republican bet na si Trump sa Kentucky at Indiana, habang lamang ang Democrat candidate na si Harris sa Vermont. Patuloy na nanawagan ng dalawa sa mga botante na bumoto habang may oras pa sa gitna ng mainit na sagupaan. Gaano nga ba kahalaga at kritikal ang halalan sa Amerika para sa Pilipinas? Let's dive deeper into that with geopolitical analyst Don McLean-Hill. Hi Don, thanks for joining us.
Hello Lois, thank you so much for having me. It's a true pleasure.
Don, the initial survey showed that they're locked in a dead heat. It's a neck-to-neck race between Trump and Harris. Final election polls would be shown, or it showed Harris was leading by a few points, which basically put them in the statistical tie. Looking back at their campaign strategies, who do you think between the two had the most convincing rhetoric, especially at the final stretch of this campaign, and secure a higher chance to win?
Well, thank you for the question, Lois. And like any other practical analysis, it's quite difficult to still point your finger on who the possible victor would be, given the very close nature of this competition, and it's still quite too early to tell. But from what we are seeing, it's still continuously neck and neck, which actually reflect a lot of the surveys and polls, the quantitative data that we have seen before Election Day. So again, I still feel that this could still be anyone's game.
Sure. Now it's curious that unlike other democratic nations, the U.S. elections, to win the presidential election, it is not through a popular vote, but rather it's a state-by-state contest. And we've mentioned the 7 battlegrounds. So far, the numbers are not yet out. But which do you think will deliver the win for the next White House president?
Well, you're right. The electoral college system of the United States is far more different than what we have here, for instance, in the Philippines. It's quite straightforward. But yes, the battleground states, as we've seen before, and the basis of our discussion could be the quantitative surveys that have been inducted and introduced before the election day. And even there, we see that there is a huge there's a huge twist when it comes to who could possibly lead. And as I mentioned, what we could do now is speculate. But both candidates, I'd like to say, have been doing well in trying to position themselves in these battleground states that have been, a source of contestation away from the traditional areas of the Democrats and the Republicans. So again, it's one of those things that you may be surprised with the results, but based on what we can say now, it's still quite consequential, for both candidates in these battleground states. And there are some states, for instance, like Nevada, that where we have a fairly large Filipino-American community, that also remains quite contested as well. So I think it's for us to determine based on how the voting counts would go. I mean, it's still quite early to say how this would go.
Now it's curious how the Filipino-Americans will vote and who they will vote for. We'll discuss that later when we have our colleague Tristan Odalo reporting live from the U.S. Embassy. Now it's also significant to ask, how crucial will this be for the Philippines, objectively speaking? Which administration would be better for the country, Harris' presidency or Trump's?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Lois. And we have to understand that the Philippines, why this is important to the Philippines, is based on three objective elements, right? One is geography, particularly because of our position in the Indo-Pacific, in the Western Pacific, which is fast becoming an area of great geopolitical contestation. Second would be our traditional alliance with the United States. It is our sole treaty ally, and of course our traditional security provider. So how that impacts our foreign policy and national security calculations would be significant. And third, of course, is the willingness of the Philippines to project itself as a crucial stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific's rules-based order. But of course, the election victory would also determine the nature and the trajectory of how we intend to do this as well in the long run with our other partners, traditional and non-traditional. So when you ask me who is better, I'd like to say that for both candidates, I believe that the Philippine-US alliance will still remain central. However, the nature and how it would be conducted would be determined by whoever leads the presidential election. So we could probably discuss that in depth in the next few sections.
Okay, Professor, we'll discuss that later in detail. Now, I'd like to bring in our colleague Tristan Odalo from the U.S. Embassy, who talked about mga saloobin ng mga Filipino-Americans na nakikilahok din sa U.S. elections. The Filipino communities represent just a fraction of the 330 American population in the U.S., but their voice also needs to be heard. So let's bring in Tristan Odalo mula U.S. Embassy sa Makati. Tristan Odalo, may malinaw na bang impormasyon kung sinong kandidato ang sinusuportahan ng ating mga kababayan sa Amerika?
Lois, hatire ng mga Filipino-Americans pagdating sa pagsuporta kina Vice President Kamala Harris at former President Donald Trump. Base sa pakikipag-usap natin sa ilang mga Filipino-American groups, sinabi nilang mas energized daw ngayon yung mga Filipino-American voters pagdating sa pakikilahok sa US elections. Para nga sa grupong Filipino-Americans for Harris Wall, sinabi nila na mas naging aktibo sa pagkampanya, sa pagkatok o sa pagkumbinse ng mga US voters yung mga Filipino ngayon para suportahan si Harris kasi naniniwala sila na si Harris daw ay ang magiging kakampi nila sa pagprotekta ng demokrasya. Iba naman ang saloobin ng mga supporter ni former President Trump dahil naniniwala yung mga Pinoy Republicans na si Trump ang tutulong sa kanila para maayos yung lagay ng ekonomiya. Hindi rin nila na ituturing na malaking issue yung usapin ng immigration dahil naniniwala silang maayos ito ng dating presidente. Sa inisyal na impormasyong nakalap natin mula sa Embahada ng Pilipinas sa US, maraming Pilipino ang taga-suporta ni Harris mula sa California, Ohio, New York at New Jersey, habang malakas naman si Trump sa Florida. May higit 4 million na Filipino-Americans sa Estados Unidos. At ngayon nga, Lois, nagaganap ang isang election watch party na inorganisa ng US Embassy dito sa Makati City at katatapos lang din ng ibinigay na interview ni US Ambassador Mary Kay Carlson. At dito nga ay tinanong siya kung ano ang magiging direksyon ng Philippine-US relations kung sino man ang manalo sa pagitan nila Kamala Harris at Donald Trump. At sinabi niyang naniniwala siya na mananatiling malakas ang relasyon ng dalawang bansa, sino man ang mahalal na Pangulo, at meron din naman daw kasing tinatawag na bipartisan support. Ibig sabihin, kung Republican o Democrat ka man, ay may patuloy pa ring suporta na makukuha ang Pilipinas mula sa US. At ito rin naman yung paulit-ulit na sinasabi ng ilang US lawmakers na meron tayong sapat na checks and balances para matiyak na hindi mag-iiba ang US policy pagdating sa mga kaalyado nitong bansa, magkaroon man ng halalan o wala. Balik sa iyo, Lois.
Salamat, Tristan Odalo, reporting live from Makati City. Now, going back to Professor Don, immigration is one of the key issues that Filipino-Americans would really be concerned about. And, can you tell us how a U.S. leadership would impact immigration policy based on the rhetoric we've heard from both Trump and Harris in the last leg of their campaign?
Right, Lois. So people-to-people relations serves as it is the bedrock of our social relationship with the United States. And this is, in fact, one of the most important points that continue to strengthen our alliance. And of course, when you're asking me about how I feel, and then I think that the most controversial part here would be the recommendations of former President Trump regarding more stringent immigration policies. There have been concerns about mass deportations, for instance, and delays in bureaucratic processes for family plan immigration policies, right? So this would definitely create some conflict of interest, some heated arguments perhaps internally, particularly when it comes to the Filipino-American community, which is a thriving and expanding community there. But I believe that, whoever comes into power would always take this into account. And I feel that perhaps the implications of a rigid implementation would sort of be toned down as the leadership unfolds. Given, of course, that immigration also has significant implications for regional and international geopolitics. So I think that these would be taken more critically, as the time unfolds. But yes, immigration is a huge issue for Filipinos, given our shared and growing people-to-people ties between the Philippines and America.
So from migration policy, we'll look also into how this election would affect Philippine and U.S. elections in the context now of regional issues such as the West Philippine Sea. Whose administration can the country can rely on, you think?
Well, here's the thing. There are a lot of evidences, particularly for the current Vice President Kamala Harris. If she wins the election, there are a number of important points that we have to take into consideration based on her performance as Vice President under the Biden administration. So she has been steadfast in spearheading robust institutionalized security arrangements for the security of the West Philippine Sea, including the trilateral between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States, and of course the Squad arrangement also. I believe that Vice President has also visited the West Philippine Sea, which is unprecedented for a U.S. Vice President. So that shows a great interest to really take part in the national position of the Philippines. And I think that was demonstrated as well with her positive rapport with President Marcos Jr. And of course, her focus on the global South is also something that would benefit us in order to alleviate certain discrepancies that we have with China, improving our capacity in other areas aside from the military domain. But if we quickly look into Trump's former administration, We have to know that it was under his administration when the Mutual Defense Treaty of the Philippines, the geographical scope was clarified during the visit of former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, indicating that the South China Sea is well within it. Under the Trump administration, a number of expansive claims of China in the West Philippine Sea were also rejected. But the thing with Trump is, because he is quite transactionalist, we would have to do our part in negotiating more proactively, right? So under the previous Duterte administration, we were giving the cold shoulder to the United States. So we weren't really able to maximize that level of negotiation. So I think that under Marcos Jr., we could do a lot more.
So it won't be a drastic shift from the kind of foreign policy that we have under the Marcos administration with the Biden administration. It won't be a reversal or unwinding of that kind of a foreign policy. Should Trump
I
win
think the
White
stakes
House?
have become too high. Yeah. I think the stakes have become too high for Washington, for instance, to derail what has already been worked on under the current administration when it comes to the Philippine-US alliance, to the point that our alliance has become very much institutionalized to work and expand towards the immediate hub and spokes network with Japan and Australia, making it very much interdependent, and to just pull away from that would be a challenge as well. Now, we have to understand that the U.S. Institutional foundations of U.S. national politics also make sure that the policies of presidents, because of the rigid and significant checks and balances, ensures that it doesn't become too radicalized. But we've seen, of course, that former President Trump had that inclination to do so. But for us here in Manila, it's important for the government to ensure and to build on that personal rapport with former President Donald Trump if he wins, similar to how former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was able to maximize the relationship with the U.S. because of that great level of negotiation that he had with former President Trump. So I believe that under the Marcos Jr. administration, to demonstrate the significance of the Philippines in U.S. security policy would help maintain and enhance that continuity if he becomes president.
So we can learn some lessons from Japan there. Now, from foreign policy, we move to economic policy. What would be the implication of a Harris or a Trump presidency in its economic ties with the Philippines?
Right. So if we look into the trade dynamics here, right, there are concerns, particularly under the Harris administration. If the vice president becomes president, I believe there will be more continuity in whatever President Biden has been doing in terms of spearheading economic growth and economic partnerships, particularly institutional partnerships like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for instance, of which we are also a member of. And of course, there have been also investments in a number of other critical industries like critical minerals, such as the Luzon Economic Corridor. So I believe that there'd be an interest to continue such activities. We also have an ongoing trilateral with South Korea and the U.S. to revitalize our shipyards, right? So for Trump, however, given the largely transactional American first economic policies, the idea of friendshoring, for instance, or rerouting U.S. investments to friendly countries based on politics rather than profit would, I think, not be something that we could look forward to, given, of course, that the whole idea of profit-driven economic activity, and as we've mentioned with the tariffs as well, indicate that we would have to do more to improve our national economic climate to benefit more from our economic relations with the U.S. So that would be something that we would need to work on as well if Trump becomes president.
Now, before we wrap up, briefly now, how crucial are these elections for the other superpowers in the world, especially Beijing?
Right. I mean, clearly everyone is watching, and especially Beijing. China has obviously been demonstrating in full force its expansionist position in the Western Pacific, in the greater Indo-Pacific as well, and how the next U.S. president would try to address this, in a way that would ensure the stability of the established rules-based order would matter a lot, not just for China, but would matter for the region's security architecture as well. Now, there have been concerns of whether the U.S. would be able to maintain its commitment in the long run. Well, I believe that like the Philippine-US alliance, the stakes have become too high for the U.S. to leave out on the Indo-Pacific region, given that it is one of the most consequential regions in the world today. And it was in fact because of a number of preoccupations that led China to become more emboldened in its position here. So I think that this would be definitely on the table. But again, Kamala Harris, for instance, focuses on the U.S.-China competition at the center of her Indo-Pacific approach based on capacity building as well for like-minded partners. Trump wants to elevate the U.S. preeminence in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, China is seen as a peer competitor. But we also look at the transactionalism. There are concerns perhaps that maybe a Trump administration could let go on some major issue areas if the U.S. and China could come up with a good economic plan that would benefit the U.S. So these are some of the scenarios that could unfold. But definitely, the U.S.-China competition is here to stay.
All right, thanks for joining us, Don McLean Hill. Stay tuned and be in the loop para sa mga latest na balita dito sa NewsWatch Live. Follow us on Facebook, X, TikTok, and YouTube. Plus, catch our programs on Free TV sa Aliw Channel 23. Bisitahin din po ang aming website sa www.newswatchplus.ph. Ako si Lois Calderon.